So this is the first session in a course of 5 webinars, okay? So all 5 are designed to fit together, and I'll explain how that will work in a second. But as I'm explaining to you this approach to dealing with tantrums, I want you to bear in mind that what I'm offering you is general information, not tailored advice for your family. So if you feel like it's, there's going to be some challenges in your family in terms of implementing this, or you feel like you need more support, please do seek individualized support. Don't take what I'm saying as necessarily being correct for your particular circumstance. It's important that I explain that first of all. But on that note, welcome. Thank you for being here. Thank you for making the time. I really appreciate the opportunity to be beaming into your lounge rooms or offices or outhouses, wherever you may be around Australia or even the world. I take that as very much a privilege, and I hope you've all had a good day and you're in a good mood and able to concentrate tonight. I know that's often easier said than done, particularly where children are concerned. Let us know how you're going in the chat, if your kids are still running amok or if you've managed to get them in bed. I do need to do a few acknowledgements. First of all, to the Victorian government for supporting these webinars. That's why they come to you all around Australia free of charge, thanks to generous funding that we've received. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we're meeting tonight, because although we're meeting virtually, most of us exist on land somewhere in Australia. We're aware that that land has traditional owners. Here for me in Melbourne, that's the Wurundjeri people, so I'd like to pay respect to elders past and present, and also I acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who may have joined us tonight. So a little bit about me, your host for these 5 webinars. Like I said, my name is Tony Gates. I'm a psychologist by training, and my area of expertise has been focusing on working with families and children in a variety of settings. I've worked in schools and private practice and consulting, and at the moment I work at a place called the Parenting Research Centre. We're producing these webinars, and we're also one of the organisations that publishes Raising Children Network. That's why you see Raising Children Network everywhere, like right here. If you have any more questions about me, feel free to ask that in the chat box. And I'll tell you so long as it's not too revealing. Now, we're talking about tantrums tonight, which is possibly kind of a sensitive topic. I'm very much aware that tantrums can cause a lot of stress in families. And we're also going to be talking about parenting, which is a very important topic for many of us. So please, if you are feeling concerned or upset or stressed or in any way kind of aggravated by what we talk about tonight, do take advantage of some of the options for receiving further support. Check out raisingchildren.net.au. There's a section on that for ways you can find further support. Some of those are looking up Parent Line in your state. That's a free service where the number varies from state to state, so you'll have to look up to see what the number is for your particular state. You could also use Lifeline, which is available around the clock and is a very good source of support. Or look up other Australian helplines and hotlines that are available, again, on Raising Children Network. Now, just to start off with, to get us all interacting, I'm going to run a quick poll. That's just sort of a multiple choice question that we're all going to answer. And all I'm interested in is a fairly easy one, and that is, how old is the child you're most concerned about? Now, that might be your child if you're attending as a parent, or it might be everyone's answering in the chat box. I'm about to do this as an actual interactive poll. I'll start it now just to save you doing it twice. So what you should see on your screen, depending on what sort of device you're using, is a multiple choice question. And what I'm interested in is, how old is the child you're most concerned about? It could be your child, it could be your niece or nephew, it could be a friend's child. You might be a teacher and it's a child you work with. You might be another sort of professional who has a concern about a child having tantrums and you want to do something about it. Presumably you've got some sort of concern about tantrums if you're here, and they'll relate to a child. You can choose one or more of these if you've got more than one child whom you're concerned about. Wendy, for you, it's not working, and so you're answering in the chat box. That's great. Thank you. You've got a 4-year-old. So I'll stop the poll there because we've got an excellent response rate. And if I stop this, I think you should all be able to see the results. About 68% of us who are able to complete the poll have a child 1 or 2 years old. A big chunk of it's also around the 3 or 4 age group, with a few of us having children older or younger than that. Now that's a great spread, and that's really good to see. I'll just close that for all of us, because the approach that we're talking about tonight should, and in fact it's designed to work for all of those age groups. It's a very robust, flexible approach. So if you have a child who's sort of right in that hot pocket for tantrums around the 2 to 4 years old, then it should work well for you. But also if you've got older children or younger children, and including children with additional needs, if you've got a child with, you know, a differing developmental trajectory, or like cerebral palsy or intellectual disability, any kind of developmental delay, autism spectrum disorder, these principles will still apply just as well, at least in theory, but you probably have some extra work to do in terms of working out how it applies to your family. Vanessa, you had a question about some other children, how it might apply to them, such as ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder, autism spectrum disorder. Yes, it does still apply. And in fact, the approach that we're using was originally developed for many of those sorts of populations. But I imagine you might have more questions as we're going through. So as I mentioned, this is a very robust approach, and it's evidence-based. Which means it's been researched quite thoroughly. I'll tell you what, why don't I take myself off screen for a second so that you can see this better. So my video is going to disappear. If you could see me, now you won't be able to. You'll see the slide a bit bigger so that you can read this better. So the technique that we're using is based on a program called Signpost, developed by the Parenting Research Center, which is itself based on an approach called functional assessment, which has a long history in psychology. It's very well studied. There's been lots of research showing that at least it has a very good success rate for many families and all sorts of children. Signpost was originally developed, in fact, for children with intellectual disability, and was then adapted for all sorts of different populations, including typically developing children. But bear in mind that this is not a quick fix approach. So in the techniques that we discuss over the next 5 weeks, we're not going to be giving you a kind of silver bullet or something to say in the moment that will snap your child out of having a tantrum. So instead, it's a very systematic, methodical approach where you're going to work at it over time to get a really good result, hopefully. So it perhaps does take more effort than you might hope for, or that you might encounter in some pop psychology stuff that you encounter on YouTube or elsewhere. But it should give you a better result in the long term. All right, some people are having some issues with internet. Hopefully it's coming through okay for most of us. We're going to continue because I suspect we will just all have our own little quirks with regarding how the internet is working for us. Let's just have a look at what you're in for over the next 5 weeks. Now, like I said, I hope you can join us for as many of these as possible. We are delivering this as a course, so if you can only make it to 1 or 2 of the sessions, you will be missing out. I can only cover so much in an hour. We've done our best to actually cram this information into 5 sessions. It's already quite condensed, so I hope you can make it for as many of those sessions as possible, or do your best to catch up on the recordings and the little activities I give you to do during the weeks in between, because otherwise it's really not going to work if you don't understand the full approach. So I hate to sound pessimistic, but hopefully you can make it to as many of those sessions as possible. Tonight we're doing session number 1, which is all about the psychology of tantrums, so that you understand why they're happening. We'll develop a sort of psychological theory, and how we can use that to actually change tantrums. Then you can see the titles of future sessions there on the screen. Next week is assessing your own child's behavior. Then we'll move on to influencing or changing your child's behavior over time. The fourth session is all about building skills in your child so that you get less tantrums. And then finally, we'll talk about tantrums in the future, sort of a long-term approach to set yourself up for success. So for tonight's session, we've got 6 things I want to cover, and all really leading towards that question in the red circle. Why do tantrums happen, and can we change this? So we'll start off with a bit of information about tantrums, okay? And then we'll move through each of those dot points, spend about 5 minutes on each, then wrap up with some time for questions at the end. So, tantrums. What do we know about tantrums? Now, we'll all have our own perspectives on tantrums, but just to set the scene, let's cover some basic information about tantrums. First of all, they're very, very common, particularly in the under 4s, so I think it's no surprise to me at least that so many of you can have a child under 4 or are here thinking about a child under 4. So there's nothing unusual, I suppose, about a child under 4 having tantrums. Now, some children won't have tantrums, and that can be particularly perplexing if you've got 2 children or more. One has a lot of tantrums and the other has none or hardly any, because not all children will have tantrums. Again, that's actually quite normal. Children will vary a lot in the extent to which they have tantrums and how severe they are. It's not indicative of a developmental concern if a child is having tantrums, or even a lot of tantrums. So that means that if your child's having a lot of tantrums, don't panic. Don't feel that that means there's sort of something wrong with your child. Having said that, children with developmental concerns may have more tantrums than typically developing children, and may have more severe tantrums. So those two, there is a correlation there, but you shouldn't take tantrums on their own as an indication of a developmental concern. But of course, if you are concerned about that, please do seek some sort of investigation or professional support with that. Now, they can be very different from child to child, and in fact, Katie just had a comment in the chat box there that her 2-year-old doesn't really have tantrums, as she would describe it, but just generally looks sooky and grumpy a lot of the time. Now, we might choose to describe that as a tantrum or not, and really it's up to you. The test really is, do you feel like it's a tantrum, or do you feel like it's sort of a problem for you? This approach will apply. It doesn't have to meet some magical criteria to be considered a tantrum. All that matters is that you're interested in doing something about it. Now, there's a lot more information about tantrums on raisingchildren.net.au. So I just wanted to read you a little quote there that I think is quite illustrative that I've taken from raisingchildren.net.au. So this isn't on your screen. I'm just going to read it to you. They can involve spectacular explosions of anger, frustration, and disorganized behavior, which is when your child loses it. You might see crying, screaming, stiffening limbs, an arched back, kicking, falling down, flailing about, or running away. In some cases, children hold their breath, vomit, break things, or get aggressive as part of a tantrum. Okay? So all those things, any of those can be part of a tantrum, or they might be much more subtle. They might be your child going silent for an extended period of time. They might be your child deliberately not interacting with you in the way that they would. So they could be quite subtle or quite extreme. Ashley, your 3.5-year-old rages. Yep, that sounds like an experience that many of us could relate to. But one more thing that I think is important to note about tantrums is that they can have a big impact on us as parents. They can be very frustrating, right? So I think that's important to acknowledge. They're not just an academic topic for us. And I think the reason, at least from my perspective, for why they can be so frustrating is they seem so pointless. They seem like your child is just making things hard out of the blue, and it's not getting them anywhere. It's not achieving anything. Why would they be doing this? It's sort of like this pointless, very sort of destructive, interrupting behavior, which is really frustrating for us as parents. What do we do with this? Well, we're going to deal with that throughout this course. So that's all I wanted to say about tantrums. let's look at where we're up to here. Next, we're up to what causes behavior. I hope I'm going at an okay pace. If you need me to slow down, let me know, and I'll do the best I can. But of course, you can always ask questions towards the end. So let's have a look at what causes behavior. Now, this part is going to be a bit more technical. I hope it will still make sense to you, or I hope I communicate it in a way that is useful to you. Let's see what you think. We're going to be taking a psychological view of tantrums, which means we're trying to get inside the mind of a child here to try and explain what's going on when we have tantrums occurring. There's a bit of background I want to cover. Now, if you studied any biology or psychology, or even just sort of followed news and medicine, you might have heard of genes before. Now, genes are microscopic. You can't see them. I don't mean the genes that you wear on your legs. I mean the components within cells that comprise the code that determines your biological makeup. All right, so the way you are physically is determined by these tiny little genes within each cell in your body, and we inherit them from our parents. That means the child you're concerned about inherited their genes from their parents. And the thing about genes is they're fixed from conception onwards. So as soon as a baby exists in the womb, a fetus if you like, its genes are set because they're inherited from the biological mother and father. So there's nothing you can do about genes, but they do play a big part in behavior. The other aspect that we want to consider is environment. Now, there are a few parts to the child's environment that I want to point out. One is the physical surroundings. The second is the people around them, in other words, who they're interacting with. And third is their internal states, whatever they're experiencing at the moment. So that could be they're feeling hungry, they're feeling tired, they're feeling stressed, they're in a new environment. All of those things we consider part of the environment of the child. And that's also very important for tantrums. So basically, we can see behavior as these two things put together. So this is the formula I'm building up for us. Your child behaves based on their genes and in response to their environment. So they might have a certain kind of temperament based on their genes that you can't really control, and they might react based on what happens around them, their environment. That we can control to some extent. So that's really the power of the functional assessment approach that we're going to be using, changing your child's environment to get a different result. Now, I'm going to put a question to you, and I'm interested to see what you think about this. It's really not the kind of question whether there's a right or wrong answer. I'm just interested in your views. The question is, how is the world different from a child's point of view? So remember, we're trying to get inside the head of a child here. What are some of your ideas, folks? There are a few ways you could do this. You could imagine yourself in the shoes of a child and think, right, how would things look different to me? Or you might observe based on some of the things that you've seen children doing. What are some of the things they do that adults don't seem to do? And what might we conclude from that? Any ideas are great here. There are no right or wrong answers. I'll give you a few, maybe 30 seconds or something to type in your ideas. Now, by the way, just a note as we're participating in these webinars, that everyone here is a real person. No one's sort of like a robot or a computer program. So feel free to interact with each other and comment on each other's ideas, but just be as constructive as you can. We don't really want anyone shooting down anyone else's ideas. So just as you would treat someone face-to-face with respect, we ask that you do that as you're participating in the webinars too. All right, we have heaps of comments coming in. I'm going to have a look at these now. I'm just going to pick a few of these because there are many of us participating tonight. Marguerite suggested that it could be overwhelming. Certainly, that's a good point. Emily, there's a newness to it. They're having some experiences for the first time compared to an adult that might be much more familiar. Excellent point. Emily, the children can't communicate the same way that we do. I think that's a very good observation. They don't have the same power to express themselves. There's a scariness, perhaps, Leanne. That's a good observation, that all this newness and perhaps a lack of control. Rebecca, not being in control, that was an idea you had too. Sally, lack of independence. Deanna, can't rationalize the way adults do. Their thinking skills are different. They can't make sense of things in the same way. Simon, everything looks bigger and harder to understand. Certainly that's a perspective thing, isn't there? Compared to adults, everything is bigger. You're not on the same footing, perhaps, as an adult is. Everything is dictated to them. I've lost track of who said that. I apologize. All right, I think we've covered, Angela, lots to see and stimulation. Exciting. Nick, you had a good point that it's not always a bad thing to be younger. There's this excitement to things being new. All right, let's move on because I'm sure you guys could fill a whole hour with your excellent suggestions. This is great having so many participants. Sometimes I really have to draw it out of people, but you guys are all really on the ball. I think you've covered everything that I wanted to say. But the main point I wanted to make is that we need to, let me just make myself disappear for a second. Why are we bothering looking at the environment? I did that exercise really to make you think about the child's perspective and think about all the things going on around them that might influence their experience and influence their behavior. Because that's going to inform why we can't just instantly stop tantrums. We need to think about sort of a longer game. And I think a useful metaphor for this is that children are not little adults, all right? They're different in a lot of ways to adults. And sometimes a mistake, and I don't mean that in a judgmental way, quite a natural mistake that I see parents make is to treat their children a bit like they are little adults. And what I mean by that is they don't have the same cognitive skills. They can't, like we heard in the comments, they can't rationalize the same way. They can't think in the same sophisticated ways that adults can, particularly when they're tired or stressed or worked up or overwhelmed. So we don't want to do things like expect them to reason too much when they are having a tantrum. So one of the mistakes sometimes is to kind of try and talk your child out of having a tantrum, try and reason with them and try and expect them to be reasonable. That's not realistic for children. They don't have the same cognitive skills. They also don't have the same emotion regulation skills. If you haven't heard of emotion regulation before, it's increasingly studied in psychology, but it's basically the ability to purposefully calm yourself down. Children can't do that as well as adults, and it's a skill that we need to help them develop over time. And they don't experience the world the same way. They're smaller, things are newer, they don't have the same ability to control things in the way we might as adults. Okay, so that's just a bit of perspective setting for us. So given all that, why do children have tantrums? Well, let's build up our theory here. We've talked about the psychology of the child on the left, and then on the right of your screen, if you can see my slides, you'll see a picture of a world. It's planet Earth, but really I just mean the world that your child lives in. Now, what's happening is your child's trying to interact with that world. They're trying to do whatever it is that they want to do, or that is meaningful to them, and do it in sort of the best way that they know how. Now, this doesn't always go to plan. Your child will be interacting with the world, and sometimes it won't go to plan, and they'll get frustrated, and get overwhelmed. Now, we've already had that in the comments, haven't we? That's really what leads to tantrums. Your child's trying to interact with the world. It's not going to plan. Factor in genes, factor in the environment around them, and it results in this overwhelm response, which is what you see come out as a tantrum. Okay? That's our basic theory of why tantrums are happening. If anyone's got any questions about that or anything further you'd like to throw in, feel free to. People are commenting on their own experiences, on their responses as well. That's great. Feel free to share that, and we'll have plenty of discussion of that throughout this course. But that's our theory of what causes behavior. Now you'll notice that was about behavior in general, not just tantrums, but then towards the end we applied it to tantrums. And that's an important lesson about this course. By the way, a little word to the wise. Although we're talking about tantrums, the functional assessment approach is actually more broadly applicable to behavior in general. So if you have other problem behavior with a little bit more analysis and application, you can actually apply it to all sorts of other behaviors as well. Susanna, you're observing that we can sometimes have tantrums too when frustrated with our kids. Exactly, and it could be for a very similar reason. You're doing your best to interact, to manage the situation, to manage the world around you. You've got various things going on, and it can get overwhelming and frustrating, and you don't always react in the way you would like to. That's perfectly normal for us as parents, or as adults in general. So let's move on to talking next about the purposes of behavior. Now, this is critical for everything we're building from now on. And really the power of the functional assessment approach comes from its ability to explain behavior in a relatively simple way. So we're going to do some work now on helping you to work out the purpose of your child's tantrum. So let's start with a little scenario here. I want you to consider this scene. Look at the picture. If you can't see it properly, depending on your device or how well things are working for you with the technology, I'll describe it. Looks like what we've got is two children on perhaps a suburban street with a woman pushing one of the children on a bike. They're both wearing some sort of uniform type clothes. Now, we might make some assumptions about this scenario, but before I do that, we're going to do a little exercise. So let's suppose that a tantrum happened just after this photo was taken. I know there's no tantrum happening here at the moment, but let's just imagine a tantrum happened immediately after this. We'd want to think about the situation in a certain way. I want to encourage you to consider some aspects of the environment, okay? So I want you to type in your ideas as we go through. We're going to move quite quickly, and I won't respond to all of your comments for this one. But first of all, where are we? What's the situation here? What's your answer to where? That's the first thing we want to think about. I want you to sort of practice describing this quite concisely in just a few words. And we've got some great ideas coming in. We're outside. Excellent. Middle of the road. Yep. That's a good observation. Possibly a cul-de-sac. A street. Possibly close to home, their neighborhood. Outside open area. Great ideas, guys. Street close to home. Your own street. Yeah, exactly. Some things that are relevant here are like the fact that they're on the street. They're in the middle of the road or close to it. It looks fairly suburban to me. There are trees around. It's not too busy. It's fairly quiet. Let's move on to our next question. Who's involved in this scenario? Now, you won't know the names of these people, and to some extent we might have to guess, but at least we can say there's what looks like a young girl, what looks like a young boy, and what looks like an adult woman. Got some ideas, kids and their mum. Certainly it seems likely that that's their mum. It could be someone else. It could be another family member. It could be a carer of some sort picking them up. Yeah, everyone's on the ball there. There's not too much to say about this. That is there. We might assume perhaps that they're brother and sister, the children in this scenario, and that would be very relevant to what happens with the tantrum. Next question is, what is going on in this scenario? What's happening? Can we come up with a few words to describe what's happening here? What are they doing? What is the context for the activities within this scenario? So you've told me who. Let's say some things about what's going on. Now, there's much more scope for this to vary across our analysis, isn't it? Some of you might have very different answers to others. We've got some comments about the attention that's being given, particularly to the boy. We've got mum is helping the younger one ride. We've got using each other's equipment, Sally, thank you. Attention towards the boy. Outside play, yep. Coming home from school, Leanne, yes, that was what I kind of suspect as well based on the kids' uniforms. And the whole scenario. Learning to ride the bike without training wheels, Vanessa, excellent suggestion. Claire, ride or skate after school, yep. Excellent, guys, you're really on the ball here. And again, I'm not too worried about right or wrong answers. I just want you to think about the context of this scenario, this environment. And finally, when? When do you think this is? Some of you have already answered that in your previous comments, but feel free to type away in the chat box. And if you haven't had an answer for any of these, you don't have to type in the chat box, but I do encourage you, even if you haven't so far, don't feel like you can't have a go if you've missed some of the questions. I do encourage everyone to participate as much as suits you, or possibly a little more than is comfortable for you. I do encourage you to put yourself out there a little bit and participate more than you might usually. After school, yeah, I think that's the main suggestion. Afternoon, after school. It could be morning, riding to school. It looks a bit sunny for me to say that. Could be a weekend, Sabrina, definitely. Of course, in your family or your circumstances, you'll know the answer to that. But I'm just getting you to think through all that. So what we'll do is once you've thought through that, you'll use that information to work out the purpose of the behavior. Okay, so that thinking that we just went through with where, who, what, and when are going to be your clues to determining the purpose of behavior. Now, I'm going to talk through this fairly quickly, and you're probably going to be a little bit confused, if I'm honest. That's just realistically what's going to happen in this first session, because we're going to come back to this in future sessions. I'll tell you as much as I think you need to know for now so that you can actually start using this and you can start working out the purposes of your child's behavior. But I perfectly acknowledge that I'm moving through this quite quickly, and so don't panic if you're not getting it the first time we go through this. So let's talk through it now. We'll explain it. You'll have a chance to ask questions. And of course, we'll go over it again in the future. So first of all, it might be that your child or the child you're concerned about, the purpose of their behavior is to gain an activity. Now, that might really mean gain access to an activity. It's something that they want to do. Now, that doesn't mean that they're consciously doing that. With all these purposes, it doesn't mean they're deliberately or manipulatively having a tantrum to get this, just that that is the underlying purpose, that they can't really help it. They're doing this because they are driven by this purpose. So it could be that they're seeking to gain an activity. A tantrum happens because they want to play video games, or a tantrum happens because they want you to carry them, or a tantrum happens because they want to gain access to watching TV, or they want to gain a certain toy that another child is playing with. Those would all be examples of gain activity type purposes. Okay, that's the first one. Or they might be trying to gain attention. Again, not intentionally, not manipulatively, but just because that's what they're driven to do. So they might have a tantrum because they're trying to get your attention, or someone else's attention, because they feel left out, or they feel like they haven't had enough attention, or maybe they have had plenty of attention and they just need to learn that it's not appropriate right now to try and get your attention. So I hope we know what attention means. It means you sort of interacting with them, looking at them, talking to them, playing with them, something along those lines. And attention is extremely valuable to children of all sorts of ages, particularly from their parents. And finally, the third gain purpose that we're going to talk about is they might be trying to gain a certain sensation. Maybe they want to hold a certain soft toy that they really like. Maybe they really like the sensation of being carried. Maybe they really like the sensation of their favorite piece of clothing. Maybe they really like the sensation of a warm bath, or maybe they really like the sensation of you stroking them, something along those lines. Like the sensation of you stroking them, something along those lines. Maybe they really like the sensation of being nude and they want to having a tantrum because they want to get their clothes on. So those are the three possibilities on the gain side. And then they have their counterparts on the avoid side. So we're trying to fit all tantrums into these 6 categories in total. So it might be that they're trying to avoid an activity. They're trying to get out of something, basically. Like they, for example, they want to avoid having to walk. They want to avoid having to do their homework. They want to avoid having to comply with an instruction from you, perhaps. Those will all be examples of avoid activity type purposes. Avoid cleaning teeth, example, a good example, guys. Avoid going to bed. Sharon, Chantel, you beat me to it. Megan, avoid eating dinner, yes. Eating is an interesting one because it can often overlap with the sensation purpose, and the attention one as well. So the next one is to avoid attention. This is perhaps a more subtle one and sometimes overlooked, that actually tantrums can sometimes be to avoid attention, particularly in older children or children with who have developmental delays or disabilities. Sometimes they'll have a tantrum because they want you to leave them alone, or particularly in the classroom, they don't want the teacher to be working with them so much. And they'll have a tantrum, basically a meltdown, and the purpose would be to avoid attention. And finally, avoid sensation. This is a common one around clothing, perhaps, or avoiding certain sensation of certain foods, avoiding bath time, avoiding brushing teeth, avoiding hugs from certain people. Children with autism spectrum disorders, that can be an issue sometimes. And sometimes, kids do go through therapy programs to work on those sensations. So basically, I want you to start thinking about these 6 possible purposes for tantrums. Now, it won't be immediately obvious to you. For some of you, it might be immediately obvious, but for many of you, it won't. Don't worry about that. We're going to have plenty of opportunities throughout this course to troubleshoot this and practice identifying purposes. And I'll give you tips on how to do that. And the other thing is, we'll probably get it wrong, folks. We'll start off thinking it's one purpose, and we'll have to change as we go along. Or we'll actually work out it's a combination of different purposes, or we've actually got a few different types of tantrums going on that are each relate to a different purpose. So don't take this too much to heart just yet. I just want you to start applying this framework and thinking in these terms. So you'll get this image in the handout with some explanation, and you can always review the recording if you like to review these, but we'll go through them again next week as well. All right, so those are our purposes. Now, just to make things complicated, I need to encourage you to think beyond the way a behavior looks on the surface. So if your child's having a tantrum, we might have 2 tantrums that look very similar. We've got the girl on the left here and the boy on the right, both having a tantrum that looks quite similar, stiff arms, yelling, eyes, face scrunched up, eyes closed. They might actually have different purposes underneath. One might be to gain access to a favorite toy. One might be to avoid having to go to bed. Completely different purposes, the same looking tantrum. Or we might have the reverse. We might have very different looking tantrums. So again, the stiff arms yelling on the left, on the right, snapping a pencil or refusing to do some work, maybe storming out, something like that. Looks very different, but they might have the same underlying purpose. Perhaps it's to avoid a certain activity. So we can't work out the purpose of a tantrum just by seeing it happen once. I couldn't watch your child have a tantrum and say, I've worked it out, it's to avoid a certain sensation. We need to look at several of them over time. We really need to go through that process of where, what, who, and when several times and possibly observe them on a number of occasions around different people to work out what's going on. So we're going to have a few goes at this, folks. Because it all depends on the context. For a functional assessment, we really care about the environment around your child. We need to be very attentive to that context. So I'm kind of pushing you guys to really think about the context. If your child's having a tantrum, I want you to pause for a second and think, what's going on here? Who's around me? What's my, what time of day is it? Where are we? What are we trying to do? Now, I was going to play a video for you here, but I don't fancy our chances of getting this working. What we'll do is we'll share the link to that on YouTube in the handout. So you won't see anything now. Don't panic if you can't see that. Everyone will have a chance to watch it later. But essentially, it's from Super Nanny, if you're familiar with that show. And it involves a 10-year-old girl having this very extreme, well, I shouldn't say very extreme. She has a tantrum where she's lying on the bed, screaming and kicking, refusing to eat her dinner, and yelling, "I want chicken nuggets." That's the nature of the tantrum. Now, she's very vocal. She also does some sort of, she reverts to sort of like a crying halfway through and complaining, appealing to her mum for mercy. Please, why can't I have something to eat? It goes for about 30 seconds. So given how I've described that, I'm going to ask you a question here. I'm going to put you to the test by putting a poll on the screen. Can you guess what I'm going to ask? I'll start the poll now. Hopefully many of you can see that. If you can't see the poll, type in your answer. I want to know, what do you think was the purpose of the tantrum that I just described? 10-year-old girl in a room, lying on the bed, kicking, screaming, "I want chicken nuggets." A bit of sobbing about, why can't I have something to eat? Her mum comes in and calmly says, you can have something to eat, but you have to come downstairs and basically be reasonable about it. Everyone's got their input coming in. I can see your responses live on my screen. Some of you may be able to see that as the responses are coming in, if everything works exceptionally well. So far, we've got quite a few in favor of gain sensation. We've got quite a few in favor of gain activity, some around gain attention. Got a few for avoid activity and avoid sensation. None for avoid attention so far. That seems fair to me. She's certainly getting attention when mum comes in. So it doesn't seem like it's being very effective, at least, if its purpose is to avoid attention. All right, I'll give you a few more seconds. I think nearly everyone has actually responded to that. So excellent, folks. I can see people commenting on the chat box too. Cooler, you've got a comment around independence. Can we try and fit that to the 6 type purposes of behavior that we went through? I should actually bring those up on screen just in case you can't see the poll. So those should, let's stop that poll now because I think everyone's had a good chance to look at that. The winner overall, it looks like, was gain sensation. So that followed by gain activity and gain attention. Now, those all make sense to me. Gain sensation, probably around getting access to a certain kind of food for dinner. She wants those chicken nuggets. She probably just likes the sensation, the taste, the texture of eating those. Again, you could say that's an activity. She enjoys the activity of eating chicken nuggets. It's kind of like a blurred line there, isn't it? Is it really about the sensation or is it really about the activity? And also lots of votes for attention. That's good too. It could be all about attention. Maybe she doesn't care that much about the chicken nuggets. And to really work this out, we'd have to spend a bit more time observing this family, wouldn't we? We'd have to see this child maybe have some other tantrums. Is it always about chicken nuggets? Is it always at dinner time? Is she always kicking and screaming like that? Or does she sometimes just go off and sulk and sort of avoid? So thank you so much for participating in that exercise. Everyone seems to be really on the ball. You've at least got some really good ideas to start out with. And there weren't really any wrong answers there. So if you weren't in one of those main categories with your answer, that's fine, and you could very well be right. I just want to make the point that we can't tell straight away based on observing one tantrum, but by thinking through what's going on and trying to match it to those purposes, we can begin to understand what's going on as we move forward. So let's see where we're up to. We're getting towards the end of the session. Thank you so much for your continued attention. I know it's getting late on the Wednesday night. You're probably keen to move on to other things. So thanks so much for your attention. Resist the urge to switch over to Facebook or something, please, if you can. Now, the next we need to think about, is the purpose acceptable? Now, what do I mean by that? We've identified a tantrum happening. We probably don't like the tantrum. We'd probably say that's not really the right sort of behavior. We might understand why it's happening, given that psychology of tantrums that we talked about earlier. We get the frustration, we get the overwhelm. It's not really the best behavior in that situation. If you want a certain sensation, let's say, tantrum isn't really the best way to go about getting it. But so we say the tantrum is not really acceptable. It's not the best behavior. But the purpose might be perfectly acceptable. Suppose your child has a tantrum when they're hungry. They don't say, I want something to eat. They have a tantrum. Well, we would say that the purpose is okay. It's fine to want something to eat. Okay, to want to gain that sensation or gain that activity. That is an acceptable purpose. So what we need to do is think about ways we can help your child achieve that purpose. So if the answer is yes, like I said, we just want to help your child find an acceptable way of achieving that purpose. And I haven't told you how to do that yet. You might already have your own ideas. We're going to cover lots more in future sessions, but it could be we'll talk about some of the main categories. There are often skills that your child needs to learn around communication. They need to learn it to the extent that they can do it even when they're stressed and overwhelmed and frustrated and tired and hungry. Or it might be a skill of independence. They need to learn how to ask for someone to share a toy with them. They need to learn how to fetch themselves a glass of water. Those things would help them with that purpose. By the way, I can see you guys are having some great conversations in the chat. I'm not commenting on those because I feel like they're going really well, and I need to keep moving with my content if I'm to get through this in time. By the way, do feel free to type in your questions. The lovely Kim and I will keep track of those and answer those towards the end, or you can also ask them in question time. If it's not an acceptable purpose, we just need to guide the child towards a behavior that's generally positive or helpful. If it's not appropriate for your child to avoid the sensation of brushing their teeth, we might give them something generally positive or helpful to do. So perhaps them fetching their toothbrush might be a good way of avoiding the tantrum, or doing some sort of ritual in the lead up might be a good way of getting in before the tantrum happens. So we'll talk about ways you can do that in the future. So either way, whether we have an unacceptable purpose on the left or an acceptable purpose on the right, we want to direct the child to something to do instead. This is a big theme for our approach. Either way, we want some sort of replacement behavior that's going to happen instead of the tantrum. So a lot of what we'll do in future sessions is how you can get that replacement behavior happening. We get less tantrums, in a way, not by stopping tantrums, but by replacing them with something else. The child can't do nothing at all. We've got to give them a better option, if you know what I mean. All right, so this is really, like I said, the power of functional assessment. We replace the behavior we don't want with an option that works better for all of us, both the adults and the child. But of course, I realize the challenge then is, how do we get that replacement behavior happening? And the answer to that is we're going to try and change behavior over time. We're going to change the environment so that we can influence what the child does in the future. Like I said before, there's no magic bullet that I'm aware of that will snap your child out of a tantrum in the moment, but we can set things up so that they're less likely to have a tantrum in the future. And that's all based on triggers and consequences. So if we have a behavior here, it's not a tantrum, but it's dropping a vase. It's just the best example I could find. I want you to think about what happens immediately before that. So here we have the child carrying the vase. That we're going to call the trigger. That's just the term we're using for it. And there's going to be something that happens immediately after the behavior too. Here we've got the mum, presumably the mum, or some sort of older person bending down talking to the child. That we're going to call the consequence. So we're going to influence behavior over time by dealing with triggers and consequences. How we're going to do that exactly is the topic of future sessions, but for now, what you might want to do is start thinking about your child's tantrums and identifying triggers and consequences. The best way to do that is maybe with a little table like that, if it suits you, like you might be able to see on your screen at the moment. Each tantrum, maybe make a note of it and make a note of what happened immediately before, that's your trigger, and immediately after, that's your consequence. And again, you don't have to be too refined about this at the moment. Just have a go. I'll put some instructions in the handout and see if you can track some triggers and consequences, because that's going to be essential for working out the purpose. So that's mainly what we needed to cover tonight. I'm going to end on a little practical tip. It's quite simple, but I think it's going to feed into what we do in future weeks. Okay, so you do have homework, guys. I'm sorry to do that to you. I know you've already put in a lot of effort to be here, but to be successful, ideally you'll do some work on this during the week, because of course all the action happens at home or in your natural settings, not here in the webinar with me. So the practical tip I want you to think about this week is to catch your child being good. Now, why do I say catch your child being good? I've used that word on purpose because normally what we do is we catch our children being naughty or difficult. We're on the lookout for difficult behavior and we say, aha, I saw that, I caught you doing the thing I didn't want you to do. Instead, I want you to train your mind during the week and really work hard to be on the lookout for good behavior and catch your child doing it and say, hey, I saw you just playing nicely there for 10 minutes with your sibling. That's great. You're going to point it out and label it and let your child know that you're pleased with it. This can be really hard work. So you might have to be a bit of a detective, okay? Because our brains naturally are on the lookout for the problems, for things going wrong. We don't tend to naturally notice and point out the things that are going well. Some psychologists make this the cornerstone of their whole intervention around behavior because it works really well. Any time that your child's not having tantrum basically is a time for you to try and reinforce what they're doing that's great. Oh, you're cleaning up and you're doing so calmly. You're doing it calmly, or you're playing nicely with your friends, or you're being nice to me, or you're doing what I asked without screaming. All these things that you can try and reinforce. And we want to do more catching of the child being good or doing the right thing than catching them out doing the thing we don't want. So that's what I want you to work on for during the week. Deanna and some others have mentioned the 6-to-1 ratio. Yeah, that's a pretty good one to work with. If you're new to this idea, don't feel like it has to be 6-to-1. Try and at least get it equal to start off with, and then we'll build this up over time. So we've completed everything we needed to cover in terms of content. I realize some people will have to jump off. If you do, we're going to go through question time now for a few minutes. If you do have to leave early, we've got a feedback survey that we appreciate you filling out. And Kim might be able to share that in the chat box. So you can, if you can stick around, do that and you'll have a chance to fill that out later. And in fact, when I end the session, it should load for you on your screen automatically. The reason we're doing that feedback survey is because we're always trying to improve these webinars and deliver better quality for you. So we really appreciate your input as much as possible. All right, let's get into question time. All right, folks, I'm going to start working through these now. We do have a lot. We have an excellent turnout tonight. So I do apologize. I won't get to all your questions. Do hold on to them if you can for future sessions. What we find is, unfortunately, due to the busyness of modern life, in the future we don't get as many people turn up as we do for the first one. the best thing you can do is turn up again in future sessions where we will actually have more time for questions. And if I don't get to you today, I do apologize. Please try and ask your question again next time and point out how you didn't get to mine, and we'll do our best to get to it in the future. And we may even have an entire question and answer session in the future if that's something that people are interested in. First question I'm going to address is from Sandrine. Can you define what is normal? With regards to tantrums, I'll bring myself back on screen. With regards to tantrums, that's quite hard to do in that there is such a wide range of what is normal. You can have very extreme tantrums happening very often, and that being normal. And you can have a child have no tantrums at all or have very mild tantrums. So there's a huge range for what is normal. And like I said earlier, we shouldn't take tantrums themselves as a sign of something deeper being wrong. Sometimes we read too much into tantrums in terms of their significance. I would say that really a huge amount of tantruming and quite severe tantrums, including violence and screaming and yelling, can be normal, and children will eventually be perfectly well-adjusted, happy adults and older children, despite the stress that they've caused you along the way. Is it Rocchio, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, is a tantrum a way of the child testing their boundaries? We could see it that way. I don't find that such a useful way to think about it because it sort of implies that in a way they shouldn't, or that we need to be stricter on them. But I think you could see it that way if it's useful to you. The main point, though, is that we do need to enforce our boundaries in a way by keeping children safe, not letting them do inappropriate or dangerous or socially irresponsible behavior or socially unacceptable behavior just because they're stressed and tired. So we do need to make sure that there are boundaries, but it's not really testing in terms of their like seeking out what they can get away with and what they can't. Wendy, you had a question about basically what's the difference between tantrum and a meltdown. I'd see them as the same thing. I'm using those terms interchangeably as we're going through, and in terms of how I've described tantrums. If you think you've got something different going on, let us know about that, because I'll try my best to accommodate that. But basically tantrums and meltdowns we're treating as the same thing. Priscilla had a question, how do we deal with an 8-year-old who still has tantrums? The same way, so this approach should work for an 8-year-old just as well as it would for a 1 or 2-year-old. So it is applicable. Sometimes with older children you have more complicated things going on as well to do with, you know, they interact in more complex ways with their environment. So we have to do a bit more work to understand the purpose. We had some questions about purposes of behavior. Should you give in, Katie? Should you give the child, essentially let them satisfy the purpose based on them having a tantrum? I would say in most cases, no. So next time we'll have a discussion, I'll make the point that we shouldn't let the tantrum succeed. We shouldn't let it work, because then it will kind of essentially unintentionally reinforce the tantrum and make it more likely to happen next time. So success is in fact reinforcing. Now, I realize that's not always possible. If you're in a very tricky situation, you need to just get out of there. Like some supermarket is a classic gray area. Do I let my child have a tantrum in the supermarket and just stick to my guns and say, no, you can't have that lolly that you wanted, or do I just give it to him so we can get out of there and try and deal with this later? That's, you know, you've got to make a decision on what works for you. Generally, you're going to be more effective if you do not give in to the tantrum. Is there an overlap between activity and sensation, Lauren? Yes, there often can be. It's still useful trying to tease them apart, because sometimes the child's tantrum will relate to activity and sometimes it will relate more to sensation, and we may be more successful if we target our responses accordingly. You'll hear more about that probably next week and the week after. Let's move on to some of the other questions that we've had. So we had a good question from Nicole about the sibling role. A new baby comes along. You can't kind of show any affection to the new baby without the older child having a tantrum. How can you avoid this? Again, this approach should apply there. It's probably something to do with seeking attention or seeking a certain activity maybe, but probably that's a classic one for attention, trying to gain attention being the purpose of the behavior. So we'll do all sorts of things of that in the future around giving your child more appropriate ways to seek your attention, making sure that they get attention in other ways and that they don't get your attention for that kind of tantrum behavior, because it's not appropriate for them to get all of your attention all of the time. So we need to make that clear in our responses. I'll just do maybe a few more of these folks. If you do have to go, I understand. I realize that we've gone a bit over time. I apologize for that. I'm trying to go as quick as we can. As you know, as you can tell, we've had a lot to cover. Sandrini had a question about what to do when kids hit you. That's a good question. We'll cover this next time, but basically you want to stop them from hitting. It's fine, but depending on it, you know, if you're a professional and rules around touching children physically. If it's your own child, it is perfectly safe and psychologically to hold your child's arms or to physically stop them from hitting you and tell them to stop. To keep them safe, to protect other people and other children from being hit, that's fine. If you have to physically restrain your child, try and do it safely, particularly if you're stressed. That's just a general word of warning in our own responses. If we're going to do anything physically restraining a child, make sure we do it as gently as we can. And to monitor our own sort of reactions in that process. Lydia, you had a question about your child not wanting to wait. What do you do if your child basically refuses to wait and wants things done on their time? If they're having a tantrum in response, if that's what part of their refusal to wait, then this approach works. So we try and identify the purpose there. Say it's probably they want to gain access to a particular activity or sensation or something like that, or attention, but they're not prepared to wait for that. We need to make sure that that tantrum doesn't work, because that's not an appropriate way to seek that, and give them a better way to gain that attention or sensation or activity. Tara, you have a question. Is it okay to send a child to their bed for a limited time, for example, 2 minutes, to help them calm down, then talk to them? This is, I'm glad you've asked that question. We're going to talk about responses in quite a bit of detail next week. We're going to go through an approach called timeout, which is similar to what you've described. Perhaps we need to, timeout can be controversial, and we'll need to devote enough time to going through that properly and in sufficient detail so that you can really understand it. But it is generally a good idea to use a technique that, like timeout, which encourages your child to, which essentially removes your child from the situation, which avoids them getting achieving the purpose that the tantrum is working towards, and basically enforces them having some time out from that rewarding scenario, or sort of that perpetuating scenario. So that is appropriate, provided you do it right. So I need to talk about that in some more detail. We need to make sure it's not done in a sort of punitive or shaming way, or in a way that expects too much of the child in response. So if you're doing that at the moment, it's working, feel free to keep doing that. For those of you who aren't using that at the moment, hold off, because I'll tell you how to do it safely and correctly next time. Last question that we'll have time for tonight. I'm going to look at these others, by the way. I'm sorry we can't get to all of them. Is it okay to bribe, from Katie, is it okay to bribe or lie to get them to do an activity? I wouldn't advocate lying, because eventually a child will work it out, and you'll undermine yourself in the long term. Bribing can be okay. Now, I wouldn't call it bribing. We're going to go through a particular way of sort of incentivizing our replacement behavior that we talked about, that can involve positive consequences for our replacement behavior. There's a particular way to do that. Now we need to make sure it's not bribing, so we're not kind of negotiating. No, we're not saying, oh, what about if I give you this? Or what about if I give you that? Then would you do it? That's actually going to be counterproductive. It's going to train your child to not do what you want in order to get some sort of, get more out of you, if you know what I mean. Instead, we've got a particular way to set up those positive consequences so that it's more routine and that it's it's not a negotiation. So we'll go through that next time. All right, folks, it's getting late. I appreciate all your attention. I know some of you have had to go already. We'll have time for more questions next time, and I might even we'll work out ways to accommodate as many of these as possible. So do hold on to those if I haven't got to them this time, and we'll work them in next time. Thanks so much for being here. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening, and I hope you get a chance to work on our practical tip, which I've gone back too far, but that was just about to catch your child being good. Work on that during the week. Watch out for the handout with some activities and the recording, and I'll talk to you again next week. Keep an eye on your email for the link. It will be a different link in your email address that you'll get just ahead of next week's webinar. So same time next Wednesday.